With the last app, let's first view what we're actually going to build in this module, so that you also have a chance of starting to build this, or at least starting to build the first pages and first elements we will need, before we will then dive into this together. This is the little application I'm planning to build, a little recipe book shopping list application. If you've taken my Angular 2 course, this might look familiar, though it's not exactly the same. So what do we have here? We do have a shopping list page and a recipes page. Right now I don't have any recipes, so let's add one. We do this by clicking on the plus, and then we got our input field here where we can simply add a new recipe. For example, we can add the spaghetti recipe here, just spaghetti, because spaghetti are just that delicious, and well, then we simply cook them until good. So here we would write our little description on how to create that delicious meal here, and then we can also choose a difficulty. This is a simple drop down, and here we could say, well, that's pretty easy, so let's switch it to easy. And of course we also need some ingredients, right? That's why I have this manage ingredient button here, and there we can simply add a new ingredient. For example, we definitely need spaghetti, can add them. And with that added, we can either change it here if we had some typo here or something we want to change, or we can remove all ingredients from the recipe. And also notice these little toasts we're getting at the bottom. For now, I'll simply re-add this. And with that, I can now click on New Recipe to create this. And as you can see, it now appears here in my recipes page, or on my recipes page. Now with that, I can also go on that recipe, view it in detail, also edit the recipe if I want to make any changes, or simply add the ingredients to my shopping list. If I then go to the shopping list, you now see we have spaghetti there on the list, and we can check this or click on it to remove it, and we can also add items here manually, like for example milk. Let's buy 10 milk items. That is the little application we're building here, and the main focus of this app, of course, are forms. It is also a nice practice when it comes to using the components and working with pages. We also do have this tabs navigation again, but you'd certainly notice that we get a lot of forms here for the recipe with a normal input field, a text input field, a drop down, then this action sheet here, a dialog where we can enter something, and then also this dynamically added form array here. This is an input field here at the end, right? And then also the shopping list, which contains a form. Forms are of course something Angular 2 supports really well, and now we're going to see how they are implemented into Ionic 2 in our example application here. Structuring this app, or thinking about which items, which pages, which assets we're going to need. If we have a look at the flow of this app, we had this starting page where we have the two tabs at the bottom, and we start at the shopping list, for example, though of course you could switch that order. Then we can go to the recipes, and here we get this plus button which allows us to go to the new recipe page. There we got a couple of input fields, and we also got this drop down here, which is a normal input field, as you will learn. And we also got this manage ingredient button, which shows us this action sheet at the bottom, which allows us to do something on our recipe here or on our recipe form. We can there add a new ingredient, which will open up this dialog, which has an input field. And if we click the new recipe button here, we actually do create the recipe, add it to our list of recipes. We can then view it and also add ingredients to our shopping list. And we also could do that manually there. The challenge for you now is create the pages we need here, and also feel free to create the tabs navigation already. I will then also show you how I do this, but I think you get the tools to do this, and therefore it's a great challenge and exercise to build this on your own. You should see which pages we need from this structure here, like the shopping list, the recipes, new recipe, and so on. So feel free to create those pages, and then you can compare it with my solution, and I'll show how I go about setting up this app and setting up the tabs navigation and so on, starting in the next lecture. I created a Plank project with Ionic start, your project name, Plank, and then --v2, as you can see here. And I want to start by creating all the pages we're going to need in this app. We of course have the home page by default, as we have a blank starting project, and we actually won't need this, so I can already delete it. And now I want to add some new pages which we will actually need. I'm going to use the CLI for this again, where we can generate a page with the generate command, generate page. And then we can simply enter the page name here. The question, of course, is which pages do we need? Well, we certainly need a tabs page because we have the tabs at the bottom. And remember, that is a separate page where these tabs live. We will then certainly need a shopping list page, which holds the list of items we have on the shopping list and allows us to add new items. We will also need a recipes list, which shows the recipes we stored in our app. And we will need a recipe component or page here, which allows us to view a single recipe and which has this add ingredients to shopping list button. And finally, we need a page which allows us to create and edit recipes. Now you could create two separate pages, one for editing and one for creating, but if you think about it, it actually uses the same input fields, right? There is no big difference. The only difference probably is that in one case, editing, we pre-populate the fields with values, whereas when we create a new recipe, we don't. But besides that, there is no difference. So I'm going to create a edit recipe page, which will serve for both changing an existing recipe or creating a new one. Of course, you could pick a different name or split it up in two pages if you prefer this. So with this, those pages are created and now stored in the pages folder. And these are actually all the pages we're going to use, we're going to need throughout this course module or throughout this app. Now with the pages generated, the next step is to add them to the app module, and then I will start hooking them up to the tabs, or I will start setting up the tabs navigation. Let's first register them to the app module. Here, to declarations, I will simply add all the newly created pages, and I will remove the home page. Let's do that first so that I don't forget this. Also remove the import from the home page. It of course doesn't exist anymore. And with that we can add the newly created pages, like the added recipe page, or the recipe page, and so on. So I'll quickly do this. And once we added all those pages here to the declarations array, you of course are probably aware that you also need to add all those imports pointing to the individual files in their pages folders, and then that you need to copy all the pages in the declarations array and also add them to the entry components array here to inform Ionic 2 that it should be aware of those pages and that it should be able to generate them for us when we need them, since we load them through Ionic 2's navigation concept, this stack of pages. Speaking of that, in the next lecture I want to set up this tabs navigation. We learned this before, and then we can move on and start working on the individual pages. With the pages created, let's now hook up this tabs navigation. For this, I will actually go to the tabs HTML file, so to the template of this tabs page, get rid of all the content in there, and instead add the Ion tabs component. You probably recognize this from the first app we built, where we also use tabs. We have two tabs in our app, therefore we'll add two Ion tab components in this Ion tabs wrapper component. And the first tab should load my shopping list page. So here I will bind the root property to a property I have yet to create in this tabs component. I'll name the property SL page. For shopping list page, I will store a reference to this page in this property then. And I also want to have an icon on this tab. Now you can look up those icons in the official documentation in this icon repository I showed you in the first app. A fitting icon here actually is the list box icon in my opinion. Of course, feel free to choose a different icon for this. I also want to set up a title for this tab. You could of course also use icon only. And the title will be shopping list because, well, this is what this tab stores, or where it leads to, I should say. I'll also bind the root property of the second tab. Here I want to point to the recipes page property, which I also have to create, which will hold a reference to the recipes page. And there I also want to set up an icon of type book, or with the name book, which is this, well, nice book icon, which fits really well to a recipe book in my opinion. And then the tab title should be recipes. So with that, the two tabs are set up. Now I need to add those properties I'm referencing in my template in the body of this component here, in the tabs.ts file. I will also remove the unnecessary boilerplate, which I don't need right now, so that I have a bare minimum component here. And then I'll add the SL page property. And this should store a reference to the shopping list page. So make sure to import shopping list page from the appropriate folder in the pages folder. And also, well, make sure to assign it to SL page. And the same for the recipes page, which you guessed it should hold a reference to the recipes page because that's my second page I want to be able to navigate to. Also make sure to add this import. Well, and finally, to really hook this all up and use this tabs page as our root page in our root navigation stack, I will go to the app component, and here the root page is currently set to the home page, so I will switch this to tabs page. Homepage of course doesn't exist anymore, so make sure to also remove the import to homepage, and also make sure to add the import to tabs page since we're using this now. Well, and with this we're assigning this tabs page to our root page property, which, just to bring this back into memory, we use in our app template, in the template of the root component here when we set up our root navigation stack. And with that we're good to go. Ionic Sturf is already running for me here. So if I save this, we should now be able to go to the running application and reload this here. And have two tabs at the bottom, shopping list and recipes. And I can indeed navigate between the two different pages. Now the theming is of course different to the example application, and there's no reason to change this at the end, so we can adjust the theming on our own. Now what I will do is I will tell you the color code I actually used, and with that it would be your task to make sure that you adjust the global theming. So here you can see the colors I use in the finished application. You should be able to figure out where to use those color codes in order to change the general theming of this app. In the next lecture, we're going to change that theming together. In the last lecture, I challenged you to change the theming on your own. Go back to the last lecture, to the very end of it, to get my full instruction. Now I want to change the theming together with you. I did show you the color codes I'm planning to use in the last video at the end of it. So now I can go to my theme folder, to the variables.scss file to change this global styles variable here. And there we got our colors map. Now I actually want to override two color codes here, the primary and secondary color code. For the primary, I picked BC7E40, which is a nice brownish color, and the secondary color is a brighter or a different green color, I should say, 7AD61D. So that's still a green color, but a kind of different tone of green. With that, if we now save this and trigger the recompilation by, for example, changing something in some other file, because changing that file on its own won't trigger it, you see that now we indeed get the different theming. So this is now set. Let's now think about our next steps in the next lecture. We created a form using the reactive approach, a very basic form I should say, using form group and form control. You could of course also use the form builder, but now I want to synchronize it with HTML. So in my HTML code, I first of all need to inform Angular 2 that I got my own form for this form element and that I don't want Angular 2 to create a form for me. I do this by binding the form group property or directive here on this form element. So by binding this property of this form group directive, I do tell Angular 2, please use my form instead of your form, and therefore I need to pass my form, the recipe form, this property which I assign here, where I assign my own form. That's the first step. Now the form is synchronized, but I also need to tell Angular 2 which input refers to which control in my form, right? I do this for the first input here, which should hold the title, by adding the form control name directive. And since I only assign a string here, we don't need to use these squared brackets here. But the string is simply title, and this is the name of this control I'm using here. So of course this has to be the same. Now let's do the same for the text area. Here I will use form control name to assign this to the description control. And last but not least, the drop-down. You could think this is complicated to hook up, but it's super easy. You just go to Ion select, and that's important, select, not the option. The select component is the overall input. And there again, you use form control name and assign this to difficulty, and Angular 2 will figure out the rest behind the scenes. Super easy. With this in place, let's save this, and to be able to see something when we submit it, I also will add the ng-submit event here to the form element and execute on submit. Now this method doesn't exist yet, so I'll quickly create it here in my TypeScript file on submit. I don't need to pass the form as an argument because it's already stored in this properties, so I can access it in my TypeScript file. And for now all I want to do is I want to log the whole recipe form here. With this in place, let's save this, and also important note, you don't need to import the reactive forms module. This is done automatically by Ionic module, just like before with the normal forms module. So let's see this in action now. If I go to recipes and open up my page, this does not look good. I do get the error that form group expects a form group instance. Now if I go back to my page, here we got a recipe form. And this recipe form, of course, is of type form group. And I'm assigning my form group. But what's going wrong? Well, I'm never calling this initialize form, right? So let's do this here in ng-on-init. Let's call initialize form there to actually create a form. Sounds kind of important. So let's do this. And with that, let's try it again. Let's go to this new page. Now that looks better. And now let's try to create a tasty recipe here, like a schnitzel, which is very tasty, and that's an awesome description for a recipe. Everyone likes descriptions like these. And now let's switch this to hard and click on new recipe, and here we go. This is our form group. As you can see on the value property, our form is correctly created and stored and synchronized. These are the values I entered, or when we look at difficulty, chose in the drop-down. So this is working. Important first step. Now let's continue our work on this form, on this page, to also add the option of adding ingredients to this recipe. That Angular 2 has two approaches when it comes to creating forms. The template-driven approach, which will lead to Angular 2 inferring or automatically creating the JavaScript representation of your form for you whenever it detects a form element in your HTML code. And the reactive approach, which will lead, or which means that you create the form on your own programmatically in your code, and then you tell Ionic 2 which form and which form elements in your HTML template it has to synchronize with your form object and with the controls you defined there. Great news are, in Ionic 2, both approaches work. So both works. You can use either the template-driven or the reactive approach. And guess what? In this app, I'm going to show you both approaches and show you how to integrate them with Ionic 2. Just one important information right at the beginning. It works really just like it works in any normal Angular 2 apps. The main difference is that you have different input items to work with, since Ionic 2 ships with some nice components when it comes to using forms or setting up user input fields or pages. So let's dive into which components we may use and then how to use them with the template-driven approach first in the next lectures. On the Ionic 2 documentation, in the component documentation to be precise, and Ionic 2 actually has quite a lot of components which allow you to create nice user interfaces. Actually too many to cover them all step by step, but most of them are pretty straightforward to use, and you also get detailed descriptions when checking them out here. For example, if you have a look at the checkbox, you will see some examples on how to use a checkbox. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward, and you will also be able to see that something we will use in our app, of course, too. You have a lot of Ionic components for components you would have in normal HTML too. For example, Ion label, which allows you to create a nicely looking, nicely styled label, but in the end it's the same as the normal HTML label element, just with some extra features. So I definitely recommend having a look at this component documentation for your use case, for the input components you're going to need. You're going to see a few throughout this app here, but again, there are just too many to cover them all. However, using them is really straightforward and should be a breeze with this documentation. Now, enough of the documentation, let's dive into using some of them in our own app here. Start creating my own input, my own user interface. Here on the shopping list page, in the shopping list HTML file, of course, since this holds our page template. Now there I deleted the comment, and my first step is to change this title here to shopping list like this to have it look a bit nicer. Now in the Ion content here, I'm going to set up my form, a normal HTML form element here. Now I will remove the action because we're not submitting the form like this. We'll let Angular 2 handle this, but I'll come back to this later. Inside of this form, I want to set up an Ion list which will hold my individual Ion, or my inputs I should say, which will be stored in Ion items. I will use this Ion list, Ion item setup here because this is kind of the Ionic 2 way of creating inputs, forms, as this allows you to style your inputs really nicely. Of course, you don't have to use this pattern. You could also use a grid and organize your inputs in that grid. That would be fine too. Just play around with it and find the style you prefer. Using the grid and columns next to each other, where one grid column stores the label and the other one stores the actual input field, might be fine too. Again, I'm going to use this pattern here, where in my Ion item, I then have an Ion label, which will be the text displayed next to the input field, though we will also learn about alternative placements in a second. And I want to give this first input field I'm creating a label of name, because this will be the name of the ingredient we're going to add to the shopping list. Now, Ion label here can be configured in different ways. And again, a great place to learn more about this is the official documentation. Here, if you have a look at inputs, and this can be confusing, you have to go to inputs, not label. There is no label element, but inputs. You find different ways of configuring your labels to position them differently. For example, fixed will position them left to the element or to your input and make sure that the inputs start on the, well, same point, you could then say, so that the inputs are directly beneath each other. You can now also set up floating labels, which allows you to click on an input and then the label will float up. Inline labels, which are part of your input then, or where you have a where, well, the actual input is closer to the label then, and so on. So definitely play around with those adjustments, with those settings here. Inline actually is the default if you don't add anything. I'm going to go with fixed though, to have all my labels fixed beneath each other on the left. And then I will add an actual input field. Now there are a couple of different types of inputs in Ionic 2. I will start with the very basic, well, input itself, Ion input, where again you can learn more about in the input component documentation article. You already opened it probably. And this Ion input here then is configured like a normal HTML input element. So we can set up a type, and the type here shall be text, because I'm going to enter the name here, which of course is normal text. You can also assign a name to this input, and you have to do this when using the template-driven approach in Angular 2. So I'm going to give this a name of, well, let's say ingredient name here, because it will, guess what, store the name of the ingredient we're adding. You can also add a placeholder. So again, attributes as on a normal HTML input element. This Ion input component actually is a wrapper to that normal input element. Placeholder could be milk, so that you have an example of what you could enter in the empty input field. And that's it for now. I will revisit this later though. This creates my first input element with a label next to it. And if we save this, we should already be able to view this in our running application here. You see name and milk next to each other, and this is my input field where I can enter. Side note, if you open this on a real device, of course your keyboard will scroll up from the bottom. So it's just not doing this here in the browser because, keep in mind, we're still on the browser. We're going to view this app in a real device or on the emulator later though. Now with this we finished, or we added our first input. Now let's also add the second one. This should allow us to enter the amount of items we want to add. So I'll name it or give it a label of amount. And the type shall be number here, because I only want to allow the inputs of numbers. The great thing about this type is, if you set this to number, the keyboard which will scroll up on a real device will also be this number keyboard, which doesn't include normal characters, but only numbers. The name, I'll change this to amount, and placeholder, I'll set this to 2 to give an example for a valid amount. Now to finish this basic form, I also need to include a button, and I will include this button outside of my Ion list here. I will simply add a button here, add Ion button to give it this typical style. We'll set the type to submit. It's a normal button element, always keep this in mind. And I will set it to block to have it span over the full available width. And I'll also distribute this over multiple lines so that it's a bit easier to read. And I will say add. So this allows us to add the item, or we could also say add item, I guess. This is now the button for this form. Last thing is I'll distribute all the properties here of my inputs too, since we're going to add something there later. And with this, the basic form is finished. Let's now view it. Looks good to me. Now the next step is to hook it up to Angular 2, or to use Angular 2's template-driven approach to also extract some values when we do submit this form. Currently, nothing happens when we do this. Feeling confident using template-driven forms in Angular 2, and there's nothing special about this when doing it in an Ionic 2 app, you can already start hooking up those two inputs here to the form, try to fetch the form or the form value when the submit button is hit, and try printing it to the console. That's the thing we're going to do next. So you may now pause the video and try it on your own before we then solve this together. Were you successful? Well, let's have a look at how I would do this. I'll go back to my template, and as I mentioned before, we're going to use the template-driven approach, so this is the place to work with this form. And just to repeat this, in the template-driven approach, Angular 2 will automatically create the form in the background in JavaScript for us when it detects this form element here. So we don't have to do anything to let it detect this, but we still have to tell Angular 2 which controls our form actually has. It will not automatically infer this, and you can really see why it wouldn't make sense for letting Angular 2 infer this automatically, because whilst you could argue that in a normal web app where you only use HTML elements, and even there you could create your own controls, but if you only were to use that, then you could theoretically say, well, if there is an input element in a form element, Angular 2 should be able to add this automatically as a control. However, even if you would make this argument, and there are reasons against it, now it's definitely defeated, because here we're not using a normal input element, we're using an Ion input component. And how would Angular 2 know that this actually works as a control for it, for this form? So therefore we have to inform Angular 2, and we do this in the template-driven approach by adding ngModel, this directive, to this input, by placing it on this input, on this component here. Now important, in normal Angular 2 web apps, you need to add forms module to your imports array and also add the import from @AngularForms. In an Ionic 2 app, you don't need to do this, because this Ionic module will automatically provide you with this module, with this forms module, because forms and inputs are such a common thing in apps, in mobile apps. So you don't need to add forms module here. So with this, we placed ngModel on this input. We therefore registered it. Very important, make sure that you have this name attribute set. Otherwise, Angular 2 is not able to assign a name to this control in its JavaScript representation of this form. So with that, the form is controlled, or is now registered also. And you can do the same on the amount, of course, ngModel. And if you wanted to use one-way binding to pre-populate this with a value, you could of course also do this with squared brackets, or you could use two-way binding. It works like a normal Angular 2 template-driven form. Nothing special about this. So with that the controls are registered, we also already got our submit button. The next step of course is to make this form submittable. Let's work on this in the next lectures.